Hey, what is up guys? It's Stan here back with another video. So in this one, I want to showcase the performance of the Canon R5 in the 8K, 4K, and 1080p modes. This is going to be as much of a test for you guys as it is for me because I want to see if we can see any quality differences, especially if we're uploading the content to YouTube. I'm going to be shooting this video in different resolutions. Currently, this is shot in 8K. And I've prepared some clips of 4K, 1080p, as well as 8K in different situations for us to see if we could tell the differences. Again, both you and I know that 8K is complete overkill for YouTube, especially when you consider 8K has a 1300 megabits per second codec, and then you're transcoding it once you finally export the video, and then when you upload it to YouTube, Google then transcodes it again into a format that they can actually deliver to you without completely overloading your internet. Still, it'd be interesting to see what kind of quality differences 8K versus 4K versus 1080p will get, all things considered. Oh, before I forget, make sure to change the resolution down in the bottom right hand corner to 8K so that you get the most out of this video. And while you're at it, if you can smash that like button, if you're excited to see the results, that'd be great. It always helps the algorithm. All right, so I shot a bunch of clips in my backyard in 4 different modes. The first is 8K UHD, then I've also got 4K UHD and Full HD, which is basically 1080p. I also have a super sampled high quality 4K. That's basically where the camera uses the full sensor 8K readout and then internally shrinks it down to 4K and outputs a 4K file, but retains a little bit more quality than the regular 4K. So we're going to be taking a look at that and seeing the difference. All right, so first up, I've got the clip of my backyard here panning from left to right in 1080p. When you initially look at this clip, you think, it actually looks pretty good, and which I would generally agree. Everything looks sharp, everything looks smooth, the colors are great. You know, if you didn't know any better, you'd think that this is a pretty good clip. The next clip here I've got is the exact same setup in 4K. And right off the bat, you can see there is a little bit more defined edges, a little bit better defined edges. Everything just looks a little bit sharper, a little bit clearer. I think the difference between 1080p and 4K is visually noticeable. And you can see in this clip right here. Now, the very next one is 4K, but with the 8K readout. And this one is a little bit more difficult to tell, but if you look at the edges of the leaves, it seems as if it's a little teeny tiny bit crisper. Honestly, I actually had a little bit of trouble distinguishing the files themselves between the 4K and the 4K super sampled version. Now, next is the 8K, and 8K, I think you could tell, at least in Final Cut Pro, I can tell that the 8K is just that much more sharper, and the major difference between 4K and 8K, and what you will see is, I think the leaves themselves have a little bit better texture. With 4K on the left and 8K on the right here, you can see a side-by-side comparison. And as I was saying, the quality difference, you know, they're pretty similar, granted, but the quality difference of the textures on the leaves themselves is just a little bit, you can notice that quality difference a little bit right there. And if we take a look here, freezing the frame, you can check out a couple of the leaves. You can see just a little bit more detail on the leaves on the right than on the left. Next here, we've got a different type of shot, a panning shot, 1080p. Again, when you look at this, you think, you know, when I'm actually looking at this, I think that it looks great. You got the great blurry stuff, you got the stuff that's in focus, and the colors are vibrant. Of course, you know, coming out of the Canon R5, the colors will be great. But still, you know, this looks like a very good picture. And then once we bump it up a notch to the 4K here, everything maybe looks a little bit sharper. At least, again, on my screen here, it looks a little bit sharper. But then again, it's not significantly so. And I think this is going to be reoccurring where you're going to see the marginal differences between 1080p and 4K and 8K, a little bit bigger difference between 1080p and 4K, and a smaller difference between 4K and 8K. Now, again, this is the full sensor readout of the 8K sensor, internally compressed down to 4K and outputted as a 4K file within the camera. I think this is going to be the most useful method or most useful mode of the camera, because 8K workflow is excessively large. The files are large. It's taxing the computer. Outputting 8K or 4K with that a little bit more quality is kind of the sweet spot. Now here, this is the full 8K in all its glory, and I'm actually really curious to see what it actually looks like on YouTube. But to me here, the gravel or the dirt, the mulch has just a little bit more defined edges. The leaves themselves just look a little tiny bit crisper. Side by side here, if you look very carefully, the gravel or the mulch is kind of where you can see the major differences between 1080p, 4K, and 8K. Once you get into the leaves and once you get into that, that kind of stuff, it gets a little bit harder to tell, but it's really the initial shot, I think, where we could really see the difference between the three different modes. And again, here it is at the very beginning, and if I freeze the frame right here, we could take a look. On the left, the 1080p is just a little bit fuzzier than the 4K. Going from 4K to 8K, it's a little bit less hard to tell, but definitely the 1080p to 4K is a little bit more apparent. This next clip right here, this is the full sensor readout with the 4K internal output. I think this, again, is the best of both worlds. It's a little bit better than 4K, not full 8K-ish, but it's somewhere in between with the 4K file size. And I think YouTube is really, 4K is where YouTube's at least currently, especially with the way computers are being able to handle this kind of files, and really the way people consume their content, right? Because people are using phones. There are no 8K monitors out there. It's just 4K pretty much is pretty much as good as it gets. Now this is a shot of 4K versus 8K, and with the 4K super sampling stuck right between. This is the exact same shot here, and you're kind of hard pressed to see the difference. And if you look really closely, you can probably see a little bit difference between the 4K versus the 8K. The full sensor readout super sampled, 8K super sampled down to 4K is somewhere in between. All right, so in this shot here, I've got all four different modes overlaid onto the full same screen here. You can see that the wind's blowing the plant around, but it's basically one continuous image that you've got. I think it's important to note that I shot basically all of these different clips independently. It's not 8K downres to 4K, downres to 1080p for this comparison. They were basically native resolutions right out of the camera. Now the project is rendered and uploaded to YouTube in 8K, but it doesn't mean that the top left-hand corner is actually 8K. The source is still from 1080p. I think the takeaway is that for most content being consumed, especially on YouTube, it's going to be pretty difficult to tell the difference between 1080p, 4K, and 8K, especially between 4K and 8K, depending on what you have. Because again, there are no 8K monitors out there. There are 8K TVs, but honestly, you're not watching YouTube on those TVs anyway. And most people actually just consume media on their phones, which aren't even 4K, so there's that. So are you able to tell the difference between 4K, 8K, and 1080p on YouTube? I know that when I'm actually watching the video on my laptop here, I had a little bit of difficulty telling between the 4K and 8K, but 1080p and 4K, I could probably tell a little bit of difference. In fact, I'm actually kind of curious, what kind of device are you watching this video on? Are you on a laptop, desktop, or are you on a mobile phone? And I'd be interested to find out what kind of resolutions you're watching. Are you watching on 1080p or 1440p, or are you on an ultra wide, or are you even on 4K? that will actually help me with my decisions on how to shoot videos in the future. So hopefully this video gives you a pretty good idea of what the quality you can expect out of the Canon R5, especially in the 4K and 8K modes. So the last thing I want to talk about the R5 is my experience with the 8K shooting and the overheating issues. So especially for this shot right here, I started out the video with about 15 minutes on the timer for 8K. I shot about maybe 5 or 6 minutes worth of actual footage before switching to 4K and then 1080p because of this comparison here. The next time when I actually went back to 8K, it said I had about 5 minutes left. So clearly the 5 or 6 minutes plus the 4K heating up, now I've got about 5 minutes left of shooting time. And now switching back to 8K here, I can see that it tells me I've got about 4 minutes left of shooting time. So clearly shooting other resolution videos does end up heating up the camera even more so, and you get basically less footage time of 8K. So can you really shoot long-term projects or full projects in 8K? Not really, but you can use this camera for 8K B-roll video. You can shoot small clips here and there. I think you can get away with using the 8K. The 8K is usable, but this camera is really mainly a 4K camera. I think it's nice that Canon gave us these capabilities rather than just locking it behind a technical limitation where they say, well, you can't have it because it just overheats. I'd rather have to deal with overheating and have those features than not. If you're on the fence about the Canon R5, especially about the 8K and the overheating issues, I don't think that the Canon should be judged purely based on the 8K performance. This camera is plenty good in many, many other ways. So it certainly wasn't a deal breaker for me. In any case, if you found this video useful, make sure to hit that like button and perhaps consider subscribing for future tech videos. I'll see you guys in the next one.